This video is sponsored by CoinCheck. It's been moved once, lit by a lens that was never meant to stay in Chicago, and staffed by men so isolated that one of them started eating newspapers. And it's still out there right now, flashing red across Lake Michigan every 5 seconds, a quarter of a mile east of Navy Pier, guiding ships into a harbor that's been open for business since before the city itself existed. So how did a lighthouse built for the World's Fair end up becoming one of the most important navigational lights on the Great Lakes? Who were the men who lived inside it? And what does it mean that the tower is now rusting from the inside out, with nobody really sure who's responsible for saving it? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the fascinating history of the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. In 1673, French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet and his father were paddling upstream when native guides showed them something remarkable. A short overland portage between the Des Plaines River and the Chicago River connected the Great Lakes to the entire Mississippi watershed. This was truly a eureka moment. In a single portage, a canoe could pass from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic. Joliet understood immediately what that meant for trade. He wrote that a canal dug through this low ground would enable navigation between the two great water systems of the continent. Though Chicago did not exist yet, and it would not for another century and a half, but the geography Joliet described is the reason the city eventually rose where it did, and the reason guiding ships into the Chicago River would become one of the most consequential jobs of the Great Lakes. By the time Americans began seriously settling on the site, the entrance to the Chicago River was already a menace. A persistent sandbar sat at the river's mouth, deposited by lake currents and constantly shifting with the weather. Apparently, troops from nearby Fort Dearborn were regularly put to work digging channels through it just to keep access open. Though it was not easy. Ships arriving from the lake had no reliable way to find the entrance in darkness or fog, and this was not a minor inconvenience. It was a genuine threat to commerce and to lives. With that in mind, Congress appropriated $5,000 for a lighthouse on March the 3rd, 1831. The contractor, Samuel Jackson, built the tower near the fort, but it collapsed on October the 30th of that same year before it had ever formally been commissioned. Suspiciously, Jackson claimed that the tower had been built on quicksand, which caused it to settle unevenly and fall, but others believed that it was just poor workmanship. Either way, Jackson was quickly put back to work building the replacement. The second lighthouse was completed in 1832. It stood at 40 feet tall, with four 14-inch reflectors mounted in a birdcage lantern room. Samuel Lasby was appointed its first keeper, earning an annual salary of $350. This was not a comfortable posting. The salary never increased in later years, and the harbor was perpetually under construction. And although the sandbar problem was never really solved to this point, the light mattered. By 1837, Navy Lieutenant G.J. Pendergrass reported officially that the Chicago Harbor formed, quote, the only place of shelter along the entire western shore of Lake Michigan, and had already saved many lives. In that context, he recommended that the light be moved to the end of the piers once they were finished. This lieutenant knew that the harbor would expand. Chicago was growing with an almost violent speed. The opening of the Illinois and Michigan Canal in 1848 connected Lake Michigan directly to the Illinois River, and from there to the Mississippi, fulfilling that vision that Joliet had sketched nearly 2 centuries prior. The canal immediately transformed Chicago into the continental shipping crossroads he had imagined. Grain, lumber, and livestock poured through the harbor in quantities that dwarfed what the Old Town Harbor could ever handle. By the mid-1850s, the original lighthouse had a different kind of problem. The city had grown up around it. A description published in the Democratic Press around 1857 put it plainly, reading, quote, the lighthouse was well enough when it was built 20 years ago, but now surrounded and shut from the view of the mariner by a number of higher buildings between it and the lake. Perfectly useless, but lighted up punctually and carefully every night, end quote. In other words, the keeper was tending a light that ships could no longer see. Though Congress had already been arguing about appropriations for a new pier headlight since as far back as 1859. The debate in committee that February was, inside of itself, a small drama. One congressman rising a point of order to object that funding a Chicago Harbor Lighthouse constituted an unconstitutional internal improvement. He was overruled, and an $87,000 appropriation eventually followed. The new lighthouse was unlike anything previously built in the harbor. Rather than a masonry tower on land, engineers designed a skeletal iron structure, prefabricated in sections and assembled on site at the end of the North Pier. This tower rested on 9 iron piles, 8 arranged in an octagon, 33 feet in diameter, with 1 in the center. This construction supported the watchroom as well as the lantern room above it. The Cleveland Leader reported at the time of its completion that the new government light stood at 82 feet above the water and could be seen 30 miles away from a ship's masthead and 13 miles from deck level. The newspaper further elaborated that the cost of construction came to $40,000. And with that, the lighthouse was lit for the first time on July the 9th, 1859. The iron towers solved the visibility problem, but the harbor kept changing faster than the infrastructure could keep up with. Over the following decade, the North Pier was extended lakeward in stages until the 1859 lighthouse sat 1,200 feet back from the pier's outer end. A small 16-order beacon had been established at the tip in 1869 just to maintain a functional range. Then the factories came, and with them, industrial smoke from the expanding city was regularly obscuring the light's beam, prompting the Lighthouse Board to recommend relocating the iron tower entirely, this time 13 miles north to Grosse Pointe in Evanston. A masonry tower was built at Grosse Pointe instead in 1872, which took over as the primary landfall light for ships approaching Chicago from the open lake. The iron tower stayed in service on the North Pier, working in tandem with the new beacon. Its useful life extended at this point by the sheer volume of traffic that had to be managed. In 1881, a fog bell driven by machinery was added to the pier's end. By 1885, the Lighthouse Board built yet another open-frame tower at the outer end and transformed the lantern room and the lens from the old beacon to it. From there, an elevated walkway was constructed to let the keepers reach the pier headlight safely in heavy weather, a practical necessity on a pier routinely swept by Lake Michigan's furious winter storms. By the late 1880s, Chicago was building towards something larger than any harbor improvement that had come before it. A 5,430-foot breakwater was under construction to enclose a proper outer harbor, and the Lighthouse Board was planning a structure to match that scale. In its own assessment, the board called Chicago's harbor, quote, the most important on the lakes, with a greater average number of daily arrivals and departures during the season of navigation than any other in the United States. And this was not a form of civic bragging. It was the federal agency's operational conclusion. I'd also like to point out that the timing of the new lighthouse's construction coincided with the 1893 World Columbian Exhibition. And this was not a coincidence. Chicago had won the right to host the World's Fair over vigorous competition from places like New York, Washington, and St. Louis. And so the city was spending lavishly to prove that it deserved the prize. The Lighthouse Board, for its part, used the occasion to display its own engineering achievements, including a 111-foot cast iron tower and a collection of lenses. Among the lenses on display was a third order manufactured in Paris, originally ordered for the New Point Loma Lighthouse in San Diego. This lens was extraordinary. In fact, it had entered in the Paris exhibition of '89, where it had won a gold medal. And so Chicago obtained permission to exhibit the item on its way to California, instead of shipping it directly. The lens featured alternating red and white panels and represented, as far as the Lighthouse Board was concerned, the finest optical engineering available anywhere in the world. The exhibition was a massive success. It drew over 27 million visitors to Chicago that summer. They came to see electric lighting, architectural spectacles, and displays of engineering that most had never imagined. And like visitors to any World's Fair of the era, many of them left with commemorative coins in their pockets, minted specifically for the occasion, passed between hands and largely forgotten within just a generation. Which actually brings us to today's sponsor. Old coins like that are truly fascinating. They pass through hundreds of hands, maybe thousands, and once they're lost, they sit forgotten for decades, if not centuries, and nobody really thinks twice about it. And that's exactly the problem that CoinCheck solves. It's an app that uses AI to identify any coin. Just point your camera, snap a photo, and within seconds, you'll get the origin, mint details, year, and an estimated market value. Old coins, foreign coins, coins that you've had sitting around for years. It works on all of them, which is great since, as it turns out, I have some old coins here at the studio and I know nothing of their origin. You guys have no idea how long I've been waiting to investigate this. I actually found this old coin on a beach, believe it or not. So the app works like this. You basically put your coin out with the head up on a table, go to the camera app, got to get in there pretty close. Once it's in focus, it turns green. You snap the picture. Then you just flip the coin over and take a picture of the back. Boom. And now it's scanning. I'm pretty excited to see what this says. And there we have it. Mystery unsolved. So what I had here in the office, unknowingly, is called a Krauser from 1851. It's made of copper. It was an Austrian coin. It is worth about $2 to $30. Mine is not in great condition, so I'm assuming that it's lower. So maybe not the biggest monetary treasure, but an amazing discovery. Thank you so much, CoinCheck. This is incredible because if you want to go deeper, there's also a feature where you can ask the app questions about the coin directly. So where was the coin minted? It said that the mint location for this is unknown. The rarity of the coin is influenced by factors such as mintage numbers, historic significance, condition, and any unique errors or variety. Incredible. This is just simply amazing. And if you're into building a collection, there's a built-in portfolio tool to track everything in one place. So if you've got an old coin or you find one in the Chicago Harbor, it might be genuinely worth something. To find out, you can download CoinCheck for free. The link is in the description below. Otherwise, now, back to our story. Meanwhile, work on the new Chicago Harbor Lighthouse had been proceeding throughout 1893. A foundation crib had already been sunk on Christmas Day of '89, positioned 100 feet inside the southeast end of the new breakwater. Contracts for the iron tower and fog signal boilers followed in the years to come. The stone foundation was completed on September the 2nd of 1892, and work on the superstructure began in March of 1893 after Congress provided a final appropriation of $15,500. The erection of the tower was finally finished on September the 1st, 1893. The exhibition closed on October the 30th, and the timing was almost perfectly convenient. Remember that lens that was supposed to go to California? Well, it stayed in Chicago. It was installed on the new tower. The Lighthouse Board installed it in the Lantern Room on November the 15th, 1893. The Milwaukee Centennial carried the official notice to mariners, a third-order light showing alternating red and white flashes at 10-second intervals would now be exhibited from the new structure at the southeastern extremity of the outer breakwall. The tower itself was painted red with black trimmings, rising from a rectangular rock-faced masonry pier with two corrugated iron fog signal houses flanking it, with one on the southeast ward and the other at the northeast ward. In thick, foggy weather, a 10-inch steam whistle would sound blasts of 5 seconds duration, separated by silent intervals of 25 seconds. The lighthouse cast its light for the first time on November the 9th. The 1959 iron tower was immediately decommissioned, with its sections carefully dismantled, marked with white lead, punched and chiseled, then shipped off to Raleigh Point, Wisconsin, where they would reassemble the structure into a new tower that stands to this very day. The new lighthouse was built to be lived in. A hot water heater connected 2 radiators throughout the tower. 2 cisterns in the basement held fresh water. At the height of the station's operation, 4 keepers shared responsibility for all navigational aids in the harbor. They were known informally as wackies, a name that referred back to an era when oil lamps required constant wick trimming to sustain a reliable flame. The fog signal was central to the station's identity, in a way that was difficult to fully appreciate from shore. Chicago, in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, was considerably foggier and smoggier than it is today. And so the horns could run for hundreds of hours in a single season. A newspaper account from the period describes the mechanism precisely: an electronic motor driving a toothed wheel, timed to blow 1-second blast, pause, another 1-second blast, then a 15-second silence before repeating. These horns faced the lake and could be heard from up to 14 miles out. Inside the tower, where the keepers lived and worked, the men could not get more than 70 feet from the blast. One keeper, when asked about the experience, said simply, quote, "It rattles the tower. The light itself flashed red every 5 seconds. Every 30 minutes, the watchman on duty was required to check that both the light and the radio beacon were functioning. Every 4 hours, he was required to radio the Coast Guard's head office in Chicago, and apparently this was the only connection to the mainland, as years prior, a ship had dragged the telephone cable away from the break wall, and it was never replaced." A similar story can be said for the station's boat, which was blown away in an easterly gale. Newspapers claim that it went off the wall, into the lake, never to be seen again. The 2-week rotation system meant that keepers lived an existence that combined genuine isolation with genuine responsibility. George Darkey, who supervised the lighthouse in the early 1970s, described the psychological pull of the post with unusual candor. Grazing across the ice-covered harbor at the lit-up skylight each night, he said, quote, "The trouble is, the city is too close. If we couldn't see the city, we wouldn't be itching to get over there so bad." His colleague, Philip Klein, offered a different perspective. The previous summer, he had pulled people from a sailboat that was sinking on the rocks, recalling, quote, "At least people say thank you for what you do out here." Now, the isolation is a story in its own right, and it occasionally produced some pretty strange outcomes. One keeper, sometime before the station's automation, began eating newspapers and threatened to jump from the tower if he wasn't taken off his posting. The Coast Guard reacted by removing him promptly. The harbor's navigational hazards during this period were not always dramatic, though. Sometimes they were simply absurd. For example, around 1907, the Chicago Tribune reported that an electric advertising sign for a cigar company near 39th Street was flashing a large white beam over the water at an interval close enough to the lighthouse's alternating red-white signal that boats had begun steering towards the shore at that location, expecting to find a channel. Several had narrowly escaped wrecking before the Hydrographic Office in Washington issued a formal warning to mariners. The smoky atmospheric conditions common to the industrial lakefront didn't help either. In fact, they were said to make the confusion worse. And these factors were, in a minor way, the exact kind of navigational chaos that the lighthouse had been built decades prior to prevent. The first major physical change to the structure came from the outside. In 1916, the city completed a massive new municipal pier, Navy Pier, 2,000 feet from the structure, designed to handle the increasingly large commercial vessels that the Chicago River's narrow channel could no longer accommodate. This pier required an entirely new outer harbor configuration, and the 1893 lighthouse, still standing near the mouth of the river, was now in the wrong place for the harbor that it was meant to serve. So, in 1917, the federal government appropriated $88,000 to relocate the tower. Sealed proposals were opened by the lighthouse inspector on July the 20th of that year, specifying a concrete superstructure for the new crib, measuring 44 feet by 65 feet and 21.5 feet tall. Workers dismantled the tower, moved it to its new foundation, and rebuilt it. As for the fog signal room and the boathouse, the low flanking buildings that give the current lighthouse its distinctive silhouette, were constructed at this time. On the night of August the 1st, 1918, the beacon showed for the first time from its new position. That location, well east of the city and fully exposed to the open lake, is where the lighthouse stands to this very day. The station's design in its rebuilt form was described by lighthouse historians as resembling, quote, a spark plug, a type of tower common to the Great Lakes, characterized by a cylindrical base and a relatively tall, tapered tower. Though Chicago's version was taller than the standard pattern, it also bore some structural resemblance to the Rock of Ages light on Lake Superior, built around the same period. By 1929, the pier lights' illumination were converted from oil to electricity. By 1932, underwater electrical cables were run from the North Pier directly to the lighthouse on the breakwater, allowing the consolidation of the Pierhead Station and the Breakwater Station. And with that, two of the keeper positions were eliminated. The smaller crew that remained was now housed in a new brick veneer dwelling built at the Chicago Lighthouse Depot on the mainland. Automation came gradually, then completely. By the 1960s and 70s, the Coast Guard was systematically reducing human staffing at lighthouses across the country as electronic navigation technology made continuous human presence redundant. Chicago's harbor signal was automated in 1979. John Gatch, who had served as one of the final keepers in 1976, later described his work as genuinely meaningful, even in its final years. A small color TV was about as modern as the creature comforts got there, though. And the foghorn remained, as it always had, the posting's defining hardship. After automation, the lighthouse continued to operate, but the station felt increasingly quiet. Chicago's lighthouse was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on July the 19th, 1984, and designated a Chicago landmark on April the 9th, 2003. In 2005, the Coast Guard declared it excess property and offered it at no cost to an eligible public entity under the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000. After years of administrative delay, the Secretary of the Interior initiated transfer to the City of Chicago on February the 24th, 2009. The city accepted the structure and promptly did very little with it. By 2020, the General Service Administration asked that ownership be returned to the federal government. You see, the building the Coast Guard handed over had not aged well without regular upkeep. A recent assessment described the station as rusted, crumbling, and gutted, though that precious lens from Paris ultimately made its way to California. It's now on display in San Diego, having completed that journey about a century late. The automated light that replaced it, though, still flashes and is visible for up to 24 miles on a clear night. In 2022, a Chicago boater, alarmed by the prospect of the property going to a private developer, funded a nonprofit called Friends of the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse. The group envisioned the restored station as a public visitor center, connected to a museum campus, a place where people could walk the outer breakwater, climb the tower, and look back at the amazing skyline of Chicago. As late as 2023, the organization had submitted an application to the National Park Service for transfer of ownership from the city to the nonprofit, with the estimated cost of restoration still standing at about $6 million. And I, for one, really hope that they succeed with this mission, since even back in the 1950s, the keepers there knew that this place was special. Take a quote from Wayne Burton, who stated to newspaper reporters, quote, "There's only a handful of people that had ever been on the lighthouse, let alone work on it. It was special."